Have you ever heard the sound of freedom? Have you ever heard the sound of freedom?
You are listening to The Flip Side with Noah Filipiak, connecting the reality of the gospel to the grit of life. You can support the podcast at patreon.com/Noah Filipiak or at noahfilipiak.com/give.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 30 of the Flip Side podcast. That's right, 30 episodes of the Flip Side. 4 episodes in quarantine, I believe. Something along those lines. 4th or 5th. It's hard to tell in quarantine. It's hard to tell what day it is. May seemed like all one big day that never ended. There's no more Mondays or Tuesdays or Saturdays or Sundays, for that matter. It's just all one big day of quarantine that never ends. Thanks for listening. It is 7:14 a.m. currently, Eastern Standard Time. That's right. I've been up since 6 this morning, getting ready for the podcast. It feels like I'm hosting one of those morning radio shows that you would listen to on your way into work, drinking my coffee here. I'm telling you, my heart goes out to those morning show hosts. It's certainly a new experience rolling out of bed this early and jumping onto the podcast. So the reason that I'm not recording at 6 a.m., but I am recording at 15 a.m. Got a lot going on today. I've been a little bit behind, but there's a lot going on in our culture right now with George Floyd's death and the protests that have been happening, and I just needed to get a podcast episode out. So I'm up early this morning. We're going to do some introductory stuff before we jump into our topic of the day that I just alluded to. So before we jump in, we have had some action on the mailbag, so thank you to those that have written in. The mailbag is podcast at beyondthebattle.net, podcast at beyondthebattle.net.
Mail time.
Always welcome your emails, and got some fun ones this episode. This is from Aaron. He titles his email Spicy Sweet Chili Doritos. Anytime you drop the D word, Doritos, you're speaking my language. They are the one bit of junk food that I just eat like oxygen. Just give me a bag of Doritos and it's pretty much going to be gone. He says, not to be missed, if you like Thai food, the Spicy Sweet Chili Doritos, are a revelation. Hope all is well amidst the apocalypse. I love that. Short, sweet. That's a beautiful way to use the mailbag to get me talking about Doritos. So here's the thing, Aaron. I've had Spicy Sweet Chili Doritos, and look, we may have to agree to disagree. You know, we may have to just say we're going to be friends still, even though inside we're both going to judge each other and say, no, there's something wrong with that guy. So here's the thing. I'm not against spicy sweet chili Doritos. Like, if you gave me a bag of them, I'd say, cool, man, thanks, and I'd eat those. But here's the problem. The Cool Ranch Doritos and the nacho cheese Doritos are so good. They're so incredible. They are the best food on planet Earth, that nothing else compares to them, including spicy sweet chili Doritos. So if I had to choose between one or the other, I'm going nacho cheese Cool Ranch every day of the week. Now, between those two, now we have a real debate on our hands. And most people will lean towards nacho cheese, and I respect that. But they both are fantastic. And my favorite one is the one that I didn't have last. So if I eat a whole bag of nacho cheese Doritos, then I need a change up. I need a switch, right? I don't want to eat another. I mean, I would, but I would prefer not to eat another bag of nacho cheese Doritos. I'd switch it over to Cool Ranch and then vice versa. So there you go. According to Aaron, try them out. Spicy sweet chili Doritos. Let me know what you think. One of these days, Doritos will sponsor the podcast. Now, I don't think that will happen. I don't think companies like Doritos will sponsor a Jesus podcast. But hey, we can always dream, right? We can always hope. So next in the mailbag, I love this. The title of the email is Like Podcast. And if you go into the annals of the flip side, the archives, I don't remember which episode it was, but in my rant, I talked about how people say the word like. And I've already done it once. I caught myself already as I was introing Aaron's email. And I have a friend named Mike, and he's a little bit older. He's about 10 years older than me. And I work with him, and he had mentioned to the rest of our small group team, who's all about my age and younger, just how often people, millennials, say the word like. And I'd never really thought about it. And I work with young adults now who are millennials and under, Gen Z, and wow, do people say the word like a lot. And so I did a whole rant on that, respectfully speaking, understanding that all of you, if you're 40 or under, say the word like all the time, and realize I say the word like all the time. And in the interest of wanting to be this professional broadcaster, your morning show host here this morning, I don't want to say the word like all the time. Just like I wouldn't want to say It's just one of those filler words. It is almost impossible to rid from your vocabulary. I dare you to try it. And so I said, hey, if you, and I don't know if I said how many people can do this, but since I finally got an email about it, I'm cutting it off at one. Only one person gets to do this. The contest is over. Officially episode 30, we're ending the contest. I said, if somebody, even though this person didn't follow the rules, we're going to go with the spirit of the law and appreciate the effort and the humor. So I said, if somebody listens to an episode going forward and you count all the times I say like, I'll send you $1 for every time that I say like, because I wanted the internal accountability to stop saying this word on the podcast. So this person wrote, I like how many times you said like, thought I do not like how I would have to listen to again to count the likes. Is there enough likes to give one an audiobook? And so, yes, I like all the likes in your clever email. I don't know which one podcast they were talking about, but I will admit I have backslidden. I need this accountability, just like good Christian community needs accountability. So I thankfully didn't have to send $1 for every time I said like. They didn't actually count them, so technically they didn't follow the rules of the contest. But the contest is officially over. I sent an audio book of Beyond the Battle, which frankly is priceless. It would be as if I said like 1,000,000 times. An audio book would be better than $1 million anyway. So that contest is officially over. Have one more mailbag topic. It is from my brother Pete, but I'm gonna wait to get to it, Pete, because it's a great question. It's a big question. I'll use it as a teaser for a future episode, because it may be more of a podcast topic than that's like saying like I owe somebody $1. There it goes again. His question, I will read you. I can say, okay? I'm allowed to say I am a human. I'm a human, not a robot. And I'm not going to edit this out, as you know. So here we go. He says, this is a random question, but I didn't don't think I have my head wrapped properly around the idea of God's omnipotence and omniscience in the way events unfold in our lives. I guess the direct question would be, does everything truly happen, quote, for a reason? I put the quotes because this is the way the question or statement is usually phrased. For instance, does God have two people set aside for each other to eventually meet at a certain time under a certain set of circumstances and say, get married and start a family? The counter argument to that, in my head then, is what if those two people then get divorced years later? Did God also foreordain that if the times and circumstances of the marriage were foreordained? So, great question. And I do have an answer for that, but I've already introed our topic of the day, and we're going to be diving into race and really what I think our whole country is buzzing about. And so I don't want to go down too different of a road now. So we'll come back to that later. Couple more podcast episodes before we jump in. Last episode, if you listened, it was episode 29 was on why do bad things happen, sort of the why do bad things happen to good people question that you may have heard. And wow, did I trumpet that we are going to have new swag, didn't I? For my Podbean patrons. Well, guess what? Guess what we don't have? Swag. Yeah, it's not done. It's not ready. I know. I fire myself, right? I'm glad I'm not your father, because then I would have lied to my children. I feel really bad about that. But that's not the case. So, look, here's the deal. 3 weeks ago, I began an intensive seminary class. So that's a 2-week class. You basically are taking a whole semester's worth of class and then cramming it in to 2 weeks. I've got to tell you, I did these. So I'm sort of in my second life of doing seminary. I did seminary in 2006 to 2009. I got my MA doing seminary that way. And I'm going back for a second life of seminary. Long story short, I'm going to get an MDiv and, kind of finish out my Greek and Hebrew credits and whatnot. And so back in the day, 2006, 2009, I didn't have kids. It's like a whole different planet. If those of you that have kids, you can think about, remember there was a time when you didn't have kids. What did you do with your life? What did you do with your time? Well, what I did is I did seminary intensives. When I went to seminary, I was planting a church, and I took as many intensives as I could because you just got credits done a whole lot quicker. And honestly, when you're planting a church, you can kind of put everything on hold. I remember I would get guest speakers for those Sundays, and for my church job, I would do seminary because I was doing seminary as part of being a part of pastoring, that church. Well, not the case anymore. I have 3 kids now and a full-time job where, I still have to work. I'm not head of a church plant anymore. And so for 2 weeks, over the last, 3 weeks ago for class, oh my goodness, more reading than I have ever done in my life. I mean, you just neglect everything else in your life. Personal hygiene, we just roll out of bed, throw on a hat. It was a Zoom because of the quarantine. So we're Zooming together, and the amount of reading, getting up at 7 a.m. and reading, not kidding, and doing very little else in my day and reading until midnight. And so, I didn't brush my teeth. I didn't sleep. I didn't spend time with my wife or my kids. You want accountability? I didn't spend time with God. Yeah, studying scripture for seminary is like that. Not really. We were studying archaeology and fascinating things, but it was a rough couple weeks. And so, no, I did not get onto 8 websites and design. The designs are done, but get the Podbean Patreon swag ready. Look, let me just throw it there now. If any podcast listener wants to be my show, what would you be? I don't know. Come up with a great title for yourself where you do my admin legwork, right? I'll send you the swag designs. They're already done. You get them ready. You get the store ready. I'm not going to pay you, right? That's out of the question. I'll give you some free swag though. That'll be your payment. Just shoot me an email. And you're hired. That would be awesome because it takes time. And man, this train is going, baby. And so, yeah, I learned no more intensives. I did the exam last week, studied forever for that exam. Did well on it, but I still have a research paper that's due this week. That's why I got up at 6 a.m. That's why I'm your morning show, talk show host this morning, because partially because I'm working on a research paper on top of these other things. So yeah, no more intensives for real. As I've shared on the podcast before, I'm in this crossroads season of life where I'm figuring out what's next, figuring out what I'm doing with school. Am I going to do a PhD? Taking classes. I don't know about the PhD. I can tell you that right now after doing that intensive. But what is cool, up until 2 weeks ago, I wasn't allowed to reopen my degree to get an MDiv, and now they changed that, they being the accrediting agency for American seminaries. And so it's probably what I'm going to be doing. So I'll at least be looking at finishing up, not that you really care, but for some of you that are tracking that. In fact, a friend who listens sent, thank you to this friend, sent in some money to help me with my school, which is fantastic. I talked about that was what Patreon was going to be for. And so, yeah, so still doing school, still super excited about it. It means I can get an actual MDiv instead of an MDiv equivalency prior to doing the PhD, which still is part of the crossroads. And I do share that in a serious note to say, I appreciate your prayer. I know I joke around a lot on the podcast and stuff, and I know we don't know each other personally. I mean, some of us do, most of us don't, but certainly can be praying for me just as I figure out what I'm doing with school and writing and career stuff. So thank you for your prayer and for letting me give you a quick update. But there will be no more intensives in the future. Intensives are for people that don't have children or jobs. And I have both. So a little preview kind of how I got onto this topic of wanting to talk about race and George Floyd. This stuff started churning in me before George Floyd's death, or many would call it a murder. But I started observing the overall tenor of Facebook, particularly social media, and just the way we as a society, and Christians included, really don't, and I'll throw myself in there too, right? I'm guilty of these things as well. And I've tried to learn from those mistakes and trying to get better at it, but still kind of have the good days and the bad. We do not know how to interact on social media. We are mean and rude, and social media, it polarizes us beyond the polarizing we already are. It reinforces our polarized society. It is just a place for politics to be very blind towards your view and not listening to the views of others. I started seeing it with COVID-19 stuff, and an author friend who I like and respect had tweeted out that something along the lines of it's amazing how in America we were able to even politicize a pandemic. And if you think about that, a pandemic really ought to bring us together. And it kind of did for a little while, like a few days, a few minutes, a few seconds. And then all of a sudden, we turned a pandemic political. So Republicans think this and Democrats think this. And it just really saddened me. And then I started seeing the types of language being used. And in Michigan, people calling our governor, moron and an idiot, and Christians, calling these things. So I did a blog post recently, you can check it out, on just how we as Christians don't get to use that language, right? Just because Jesus called, because I wrote that and people were commenting, I wrote a post about the way we talk, and then people commented, well, Jesus called people brood of vipers. And John the Baptist did as well. So I did a little blog post. You can check it out on why Jesus got to call people broods of vipers, and John the Baptist did as well. But you don't. You don't get to do that. We're actually, as Christians, commanded to not do that and to just use respectful language. And it's good to protest. It's good to disagree with your politicians. The political system is very corrupt, and so it's not at all saying just need to agree or not talk about these things, but learning to talk about them in a way that Jesus and the scriptures command us to. So I was already talking about that. Oh, and I reached out to this guy. Hopefully he's interested in being on the podcast. We're just trying to nail down a date, so I don't want to say it's going to happen yet or not, but I really like the way he talks about controversial issues. Most of his books are around controversial issues, and I want to go down a path. Maybe it'll be for a few episodes, I'm not sure, but on the podcast talking about how to talk about things, if that makes sense. And so then, in the midst of all this, we have the Ahmaud Arbery death, the Breonna Taylor death, George Floyd's death, and so it's just adding fuel to the fire. And the way people talk about things, and now it just got to a point beyond that subject itself of how we talk about polarizing things. It's gone beyond that, where for me personally, I need a place to talk about George Floyd's death, and I need a place to talk about the protests and the riots and to process those. And honestly, I hope this is a place for you to be able to process those. I mean, if you don't know my history, if you've just met me recently or just found the podcast recently, I founded a church in Lansing. I won't give you the whole story, but God in his Pete, I'm thinking of your question you sent in God's sovereignty, he put me in the inner city, and it was an accident on my end, but God put me in the inner city. I bought a house in the inner city. My church was in the inner city, and we became quickly an inner city church plant. We also started, again, God had this planned out. It wasn't like I went into it thinking we're going to do an inner city park ministry and have this inner city park be this huge part of who I am as a person and who our church is. But we started an inner city park ministry, not like a one-day carnival, but weekly. We were there all summer long, and then we did stuff year-round with those kids and teens, and they started coming to our church on Sundays, and we all were within a few blocks of each other and a few blocks of where I lived, and I was doing cookouts at my house, and I bought a basketball hoop, and I'd have kids over in the driveway, and it was just real messy ministry, and I did that. We did the park ministry for 11 years. I did and it continues on now in a little bit different format in Lansing still. I pastored that church for 13 years. And so in that history, and then as it really was the Michael Brown death in Ferguson, and I guess prior to that, the Trayvon Martin case in Florida, those, at least on my radar, and I think on the national radar as well, those were the times in sort of when it grabbed the popular attention of this generation, right? The popular attention, there'd been cases certainly in the past, but on my radar, for whatever that means, and maybe on yours as well, those were the two news stories where people started talking about Black Lives Matter, and people started talking about police brutality, and people started talking about when unarmed black men particularly, but certainly women as well, thinking of Breonna Taylor recently, get killed by police. And it started this huge, again, polarizing, oftentimes on political lines, oftentimes on skin color lines. And for me, I've been in the racial reconciliation conversation for a little while. Certainly no expert now and no expert then, but I have been on the road longer than many of my white friends, at least, though certainly not experienced these issues by any stretch the way that my friends of color have. So that's just a little bit of my background. So with that, with pastoring, and we began in 2008 after reading the book Divided by Faith, and in a seminary class at GRTS. Back in that first round of seminary that I did, got to hear one of the authors of Divided by Faith speak, and in that class, it just really shifted my view of the church and how the church is supposed to be multi-ethnic, and for the first time, just seeing that the world that I was raised in, this white suburban world that was very far away from things like police brutality, very far away from things like inequality. So I didn't experience those things. And when you don't experience those things and you're not exposed to those things, you kind of just think they don't exist, right? You think, well, they're not in my world, and if they're not in my world, they must not exist. And so it was 2008 when in that class and reading that book is when that paradigm began to change, and when God spoke to me and said, you're going to pastor a multi-ethnic church, like your church that you planted, which even though we were doing inner city ministry for about a year at that point, we were a small church of young, middle-class white people. And we were all under 30. You know, I was in my early 20s. I think the oldest guy at our church was in his early 30s. Shout out to Jeff. He's still one of my close friends. We were at a conference once, and this elderly lady, I told her we had driven there, and it was just me and him. And she looked at me and said, "You can drive?" I think I was 23. She thought I was 15 or something. And then she thought Jeff was my dad. And I was 23 and he was like 34 at the time. And so, yeah, Jeff's not my dad. So yeah, we were this super young church, and we were all white. And then we were small too. I mean, we started out small. We had maybe 30 to 50 people for those first couple of years. So around 40 white, young, middle-class folks, and then 12 to 15 black kids would just walk to church from the neighborhood, and we had video games, and we had food, and we loved them. We had a relationship with them. It was crazy, and we did not know what we were doing. I did not know what I was doing, so we're still a very white church at the time in the way we did ministry, and that was when it began. It was in 2008, and I thought it would have been, I thought it was going to be a lot easier than it was. And that really is it's a whole separate story. I share that to share. This is how I got into this work. And it is a work. So there's a 3-day understanding racism training that I've been to. We started a chapter in Lansing that a bunch of Lansing pastors and churches have now gone through. And wow, I would say those 3-day understanding racism trainings, they took what I learned in Divided by Faith and in that class, and they took it to a level in my life where it will never leave me, right? You can read a book and be inspired. You know, you can go to a conference and be inspired, but we've all been there. You go home and you kind of just go back to life as usual. And those trainings, along with being in proximity with people of color and living in the city and doing the church ministry and trying to become multi-ethnic. I mean, but really those 3-day trainings and doing them 3 times over the course of a few years, this will never leave me. And I started blogging about these things. You can go in the archives of my blog and you'll see I've been talking about this stuff for a little while, about Black Lives Matter. I used to have a Black Lives Matter yard sign in my sign in Lansing, and we'll get into this a little bit too with these protests where when I eventually pulled that out of my yard in Lansing because for a while Black Lives Matter back then, as it was developing, it felt to me like a peaceful protesting sort of thing, and then it kind of got big and it was becoming violent and you know, I did a whole blog post on that. You can check that out if you're interested. Some of that stuff I wrote years ago, it's not where I am today, but it's still good stuff. It's where I was then. And I should add too that 2 of the podcasts that I did were specifically about race. So you can find those out there as well. One of them, Black and White Theology with my friend Tyler St. Clair, is on this podcast thread. So you can go back and listen to those. And then Tyler and I did another podcast prior to that one with my friend Kyle Lake. And it's called Chopping It Up, a podcast about race, and race. And that's not on this thread, but you can certainly find that out there still in podcast land, where you find your podcast. And so that just gives you a little bit of intro, well, a lot of intro about sort of my history with these subjects. And I'm not sure if I've mentioned this yet on the podcast or not as I've reflected, but I certainly thought, well, if you go back to episode 15 of this podcast, was it 15? Holy smokes, 15. I'm sorry, I just feel really old all of a sudden. I mean, this is what I mean. Episode 15, how an urban multi-ethnic church planter ended up in Middleville and working at a suburban megachurch. I wrote that. I did that episode in August 23rd. That was really my first week on the job. My first day on the job was August 19th, 2019. That just feels like it was just yesterday. But I remember I was sitting at my in-laws' table recording that. But wow, and this is episode 30. So that was halfway through the flip side, and now here we are. So that's just a little bit surreal in some ways. Anyway, episode 15. There you go. You can listen to kind of how I got out in the suburbs after kind of giving you that story, and I do share some of that story there. But I know I don't share it all, and some of it isn't podcast shareable. But man, we went down this path so far and so deep, and our church had become multi-ethnic, though still white in its overall, I would say, makeup. We were statistically multi-ethnic, about at that 80-20% divide. And getting there was really a monumental effort to do and to be, and there's much more to talk about on how to become a multi-ethnic church, and I've blogged about those things. You can check those things out. But we took it another step further. We merged with a small black church, small group of people, about a dozen people or so. But a lot of that number was of staff, and so we took on some staff. We were super excited about it, and it really was something we thought, man, this is the next step, next level. And it was, looking back on it, it was a real huge step of faith, and we did that. We were officially merged for about 9 months, and then in spring 2018, the merger dissolved. And without getting into the details of that was really hard. It was really, really hard. And the hard as in when it dissolved, it was really hard to process through all of that. And so when you go down this path, it's not, when you first get on this path, and let's say you're for the first time writing Facebook posts about George Floyd's death, and you're kind of coming out, so to speak, to your white friends and on Facebook, and you're saying, yeah, I'm for Black lives, I'm against police brutality. That's an important step, and it really is, but you are just at the very tip of the iceberg, my friend, and I encourage you to stay on the path. But this is something I'm going to come back to over and over. We are so broken. Like our culture is so broken. White people are so broken. Black people are so broken. Our America, oh my goodness, is so broken. And I'm predominantly using broken in the theological sense, in the Genesis 3 sense, that God created the world and there was a fall where humanity rebelled against God, and that rebellion, sin, has broken things. And I want to use the word beyond repair. And that is true beyond repair. And the only one who can repair it is Jesus. But there's still that already but not yet tension, right, of Jesus's repair. That Jesus in the empty tomb has repaired the brokenness, but we still live in the midst of the brokenness. And I talked about that in last episode of why do bad things happen. That was a kind of a foundational principle of that episode. But the United States specifically is extremely broken when it comes to race and things like police brutality. And when you were raised like I was raised, and again, it's not a knock on my parents or anything like that. I just mean when you're raised in the suburbs, when you're raised away from these things being a regular part of life, you see things in an individual sort of way. And so you see the death of Michael Brown and you go, oh, it's a black guy that got killed. Like that happens. That's sad. But what's the uproar all about? You see the death of George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery and you say, okay, it happens. It's sad, but what's the uproar all about? And we only see things in an individual sort of way, as if these things are isolated from history, not as what they actually are, which is a continuation of history. And I will come back to Michael Brown in a little bit. I'm using his name specifically because it's different. His situation, I think, is something we need to learn from as we talk about these things. But all of these cases and the reaction to all of these cases, it's a continuation of a long history, specifically of our country. Think about how a country is built and how an economy is built and how these neighborhoods are built that we all live in. We all live somewhere, and those things were all built. They didn't just happen overnight. They were all built over the course of hundreds of years and generation after generation. And so when I say things are broken beyond repair, I mean things are really, really broken. We're in a sense racially today of brokenness that's been a piling up of broken down. I mean, think about if you were building a building and the foundation was broken and then the next level was broken, the next level was broken. I mean, this thing is really, really, really broken. And what's sad, and I was taught that something similar, is Martin Luther King Day rolls around, and in all of the white, suburban or rural schools, kids like my daughter, she just finished second grade, and I love Martin Luther King, and I love that they're teaching about him in schools, and I love that my daughter is drawn to him as a person. But as she shared with us about what she learned in her white rural school about Martin Luther King, is that racism's over. Martin Luther King ended racism, and now it's all good. Everything's good now. That is so sad. And I think for a lot of white people, that's what Martin Luther King represents. He's our out. Martin Luther King fixed all that. Like, there's no more racism. And again, we think about things so individually. And again, we think about it so much in our experience. So we think, well, I'm not racist. I don't think poorly of black people. We think racism is just calling someone the N-word. That's racist. Or if they showed up to our church, I'm not going to talk to them. I'm just going to go talk to, and that does happen, by the way. But it's not. But we think I'm going to go talk to them. I'm going to be nice to them. I'll bake them cookies. I'll be their friend. I'm going to be kind. So racism's over because we're kind now. Like, now a black person can sit anywhere they want on the bus. They can go, they can drink from the same drinking fountain. They can be in the same schools, and that's a whole other subject with schools. But we're not going to. There's just so many threads to this. But my point is, we think of it on an individual level, not on a systemic level. And so on the individual level, if one, it's two-pronged. My experience as a white individual says this isn't happening, that means it isn't happening. even though people of color are shouting and shouting and shouting, saying, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening. And white people are saying, and I'm generalizing here, but historically speaking, white people are saying, what's happening? What are you talking about? It's because, and it comes from us being so segregated in our society. So segregated. Almost irreparably segregated. And if all I'm talking about today can be boiled down to one thing, it is the segregation of white and black people. I don't mean the legal segregation of our past, of the civil rights movement and prior of Jim Crow era and prior to that, though that's certainly where it came from. That's certainly what got us into the grooves that we are in now. But the continued segregation and the lack of proximity, both of white and black people and white and black culture, but also the lack of proximity of white people to black issues, the issues that black people face on a regular basis, the fact that white people don't face those issues and then aren't in community with black people in order to learn about those issues, and then we only get our exposure to those issues from the news, right? from Facebook, from this very polarized, we all are around our same tribe and we're just hearing like the same thing that we want to hear. It's a very, very broken situation and system. So let's get into some specifics of what we're dealing with right now in our current climate. So after Ahmaud Arbery's death, I did a blog post on why it's a big deal when an unarmed black man is killed, and particularly by the police, even though in Arbery's case it was by a former police officer and his son. But that post, and I'll link to it in the notes, the show notes, that post was a response to questions that I was getting and seeing on Facebook about his death. And the question comes from sometimes well-meaning white folks, right, that want to learn. Oftentimes, sadly, I think not from well-meaning white folks, as in, hey, I have my mind made up, and here's why, and kind of it's said in a way that it's not always said in a humble, I want to learn sort of way. And that's always frustrating. Again, back to the Facebook thing where we just kind of take jabs and throw grenades at each other. But the question is, and I alluded to it earlier, but essentially, look, it's sad that this guy got killed, but why are you saying it's racism? This happens, you know. Black people get killed, so do white people. White people get killed too. And so why are you making such a big deal out of this? And I'm getting a similar question now that I may or may not do another blog post on, but I'll kind of address it here as well. But with George Floyd's death, people that have either written into me or have posted or I've seen their question, and it's putting the stat out there. More white people get killed by police than black people. And frankly, this just sounds like one of those news, just jaded news sources where we're gonna prove our point. You know, first of all, there's way more white people in the United States than black people. Black people make up 13% of the population. I don't have offhand how many percent white people make up, but it's a lot more than 13%. We make up the most in the United States. So chances are, I hope there's more white people killed by police than black people, because there's only 13% of our population is black people. But that's not the point even to answer the question. And what I do in the blog post I posted recently about Ahmaud Arbery, I just went through some of the history and talked about lynchings, the I should pull it up so I have the stats in front of me. I don't, but I believe it was around 4,000 recorded lynchings there's now a national lynching museum in Alabama, and it looks like one of those just very sobering, places. It's meant to be sort of the Holocaust museum of the American slavery and lynching and Jim Crow eras. And you look at that history, the history of black people being killed by either white law enforcement directly, and not just lynchings, but just rampant and or white people who do that, and who, here's the thing, who don't get prosecuted for what they did. So when a white person, generally speaking, gets killed by police, and it's an unarmed white person, and they weren't doing anything wrong, and these sorts of things, generally speaking, that white person will see justice. Like, that white person's family, that case will go to trial. That officer will be tried. That officer will be punished. Again, and there's exceptions to this rule, and that's something. It's just not. If there's always going to be exceptions to the rule, so you can always find a white person who was killed by police and they didn't see justice, and often these news outlets will take one of those cases and then throw it out there. It's like taking we found an example of a Mexican immigrant who's a criminal, so we're going to just shoot that out to our news outlets and say Mexican immigrants are criminals. That's how these news outlets work, right? And so that, and again, the polarization and the way we divide along political lines. It's okay. So back to the history of America and of police brutality in America. What white folks need to understand, and I mean this just in an educational way, to understand why there is an uproar like there is when it's caught on video. And again, the video has changed everything, and black people are saying, are upset, sad that white people needed video to see these things. Like, we didn't believe black people that it was happening before there was video, but now that there's video, we now believe and have the uproar that is starting. And even with the video, many white people are saying, no, this isn't what you're saying that it is. So what's really, really important to understand, just as an educational thing of no matter where you're at on the political spectrum or what you agree or disagree with, understanding why the outrage is there, why the protests are there. It is because of the history of police brutality against black people. The history that I chronicle in that article, I put it in the link. You go all the way back in our nation's history, and every single step of the way, you see black people getting killed by white people and white people not getting in trouble for it, over and over and over again. And of course, that's going to seep into the police departments, because the generations prior, it was a given that this is what was going to happen. The police could kill black people and they weren't going to get in trouble for it. They weren't going to face charges for it. It was just part of normal life. And so that's not just going to get removed because, Martin Luther King, did his thing. That culture is still going to be embedded. And there's a lot of layers to this, right? Certainly not saying all police officers are bad. And again, with the polarization and the way we don't know how to talk about things in our culture, that's often what can happen. And even in the riots, you see police officers getting attacked or police cars getting burned, and it's this idea that it's black people versus the police. And when Black Lives Matter came out, people were saying Blue Lives Matter, and it was police versus black people. And it just breaks my heart because it's not even true. First of all, who's saying, and some are saying, but it would be very false to say all police officers are bad. It also would be false, and you'll see this. A friend of mine just posted. I don't have cable. I don't watch Fox News. I guess I'll see articles people share and whatnot. But they were saying on Fox News that the guy, and pardon me, I don't remember his name, the guy that killed George Floyd, that officer, on Fox News, they were saying, oh yeah, that's really bad, but this is an isolated incident. That guy was a bad apple, and it gives the idea that there's no such thing as police brutality. Like, this isn't actually a thing. There's bad police officers, but there's not something such as police brutality. And black people are saying, this has been my whole life. This has been everything I've ever known, everything my parents have ever known. And so when another black person gets killed and it makes national news and it's on video, it's just bringing up this pattern. It's a pattern of history. You can deny historical fact, talking about Emmett Till and just all of these black people that have been killed by white people, often by police. I mean, it's historical where there's a trend, and it's not a trend that's in the white community. So certainly white people have been killed by police officers, but I don't walk around in fear. My kids don't walk around in fear of police officers or of that if I get pulled over, that my life might be at stake because this officer might get a little trigger happy or might be scared of me, or these sorts of things. And I'm not condemning police either. I think police have a very, very hard job. I think I don't think you have to say think. PTSD is a serious, serious thing. And as someone who lived in the inner city for 15 years and did inner city ministry, and maybe this isn't politically correct to say, but the truth is the inner city, not generalizing all people that live in the inner city, but it's a hard place. They call it the mean streets for a reason. The reason for that is not because of the people living there. It's because, and we'll get to this here in a moment when I get in talking about Divided by Faith and how we got to the place that we're in. But you have food insecurity, you have housing insecurity, you have economic insecurity, employment insecurity. You have all of these insecurities that people in the inner city are being raised up in from the day they were born. You have families that have broken down, and there's, again, reasons that these families have broken down. And so kids are looking for places, they're looking for ways to connect. And this certainly isn't for everybody in inner city, but talk to people doing inner city ministry. And I'm begging kids. I'm like, follow Jesus. Come to church, have this be your community. But there's a reason people join gangs. They're looking for community. They're looking for belonging. They're looking for acceptance. They're looking for opportunity that has been deprived from the inner city, which is where the black community was put by law, by governmental law. And we'll talk about that a little bit here in a moment. There's so many layers to this, and I don't plan to be able to address all of it in one podcast episode, and there's a danger in that, obviously, because I ask for your grace as I'm attempting to give an overview, sort of, maybe education is a word to use, of how we got to where we are. So back to the point that that I want to make for this section is, when there's a black person killed by police specifically, but in general as well, and they were unarmed, and there's a protest and there's a hashtag made, it is because of history. It is because this has been the regular experience of black people all throughout our nation. And I'm going to play for you the audio of a video. I'll put the video into the show notes if you want to watch the video. But it's black parents talking to their kids about what to do if they get pulled over. And if you're white and you're listening to this, you say, wow, I would never, ever have to talk to my kids about this. And as you listen to it, I want you to say, are they just making that up? Like, is this just some lie that's been spread around in the black community? I really believe there's no way you could say that. There's no way that parents would take this seriously with their kids. And I'm telling you, and it's never good to generalize. I'm sure there's exceptions to this. But as far as I can think of, every single black person I've talked to has had this conversation with their kids. And so I'm going to let you listen to it. And I have you listen to it to back up what I'm saying, that this is historical. This is a part of what it means to be black in America, and it is not a part of what it means to be white in America. It doesn't matter what stats you find. It doesn't matter if you can find a stat that says more white people are killed by police than black people, which, again, doesn't account for if those white people were armed, if those white people had done something, or black people in that stat had done something, wrong, illegal, aggressive towards the officer. Again, the amount is irrelevant because there's way more white people in our country than black people. So, but my point is, you can try to find an argument like that. Someone will put one together and throw some stats together that aren't really sensible. When you hear this video, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you have an entire black community fearing for their lives that a police officer has the right to kill them at any time, and there's not repercussions in our legal system for a police officer that kills somebody in this way. Up until recently, things are starting to change a little because of the protests, and there's so many places to go here. Sorry if this is a scatterbrained episode, but now I'm just starting to hear, why are they protesting? The guy got arrested. He got arrested because they're protesting. Like, that argument actually proves itself wrong. Like, the protests are actually working. They're actually changing the legal system. Not just this one, but all of them. The pressure being put on mayors and on governors and on judges and legal systems and on communities, it's actually starting to change the legal system. It's not a matter of, oh, he got arrested, so why is everyone so upset? Why are people protesting? The protests are actually working. So that's again, I'm a little scatterbrained though. Let's jump into this video and listen to black parents talking to their children about what to do if they get pulled over.
We actually have a line that we do at our house. We practice this thing. What is it?
I'm Ariel Sky Williams. I'm 8 years old. I'm unarmed and I have nothing that will hurt you.
It's just kind of a thing we practice at our house. There are great police officers out there. There's also some police officers who are not so good.
And my fear is that you run across one of those bad ones.
For some reason, people of color have always been a target by the police.
Before they became a policeman, they were a person. And that person took all their ideas and all their thoughts and all their prejudice into their job.
Why would a police officer assume that you did something bad?
Maybe because of my skin color.
I remember being put in handcuffs for something that had nothing to do with me. I was literally walking in the mall. Cops slammed me on the ground, busted my lip, chipped my tooth. That actually made me really mad.
How about the time they pulled us over with me in the car and arrested me and left all of you guys sitting in the car and nobody knew how to drive on the side of the road because the bumper on the car was kind of hanging off?
No.
You know, we live in Puyallup. There's people that don't even have a bumper on their car.
My rear brake light wasn't working, and I got to my destination and they were working.
I was about your age, actually. They grabbed me.
Why?
I didn't know at the time. They just grabbed me. They threw me onto the police car.
I got tased that time. That time they tased me because they said I wasn't complying.
Ariel, are you okay?
What's wrong, baby? I'm okay. I'm alive, all right? Every day I get to see you. I get to do this, right? All right, come on. Let's calm down. Let's finish this, all right? You good? Hey, you making me cry. Come on.
You have to be careful when you're out there in this world because this world's not going to always be honest or fair to you. I know, Sean, you got a little bit lighter than the rest of them, so it's a possibility you won't get stopped.
Sound like you just pulled him over.
Okay. If you're driving, cop pulls you over.
Police gets out the car, comes to the window. Tick, 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 tick. What would you do?
License and registration, please, ma'am.
Why do you think I pulled you over?
I don't know, tell me.
When a police officer says something to you, don't, you're black. You can't be looking at them saying, oh, I don't know, why don't you tell me?
Well, I mean,
that right there is giving them the license to pull you out of your car and physically harm you because it will be done.
Don't get upset, don't get sassy. Why did you pull me over? You don't have, I know how, just follow instructions and stay calm.
Okay.
Do you think just being a police officer and pulling you over, regardless of if you feel you've done something or not, they should get your respect?
That's a tricky question.
The answer is yes.
Yes. If you gotta go to your wallet to get your ID, say, can I go reach in my back pocket to get my ID out?
You could do what I do, and I show them my hands, so when they're walking up, they see I don't have anything in my hands.
I'm Ariel Sky Williams, and I have nothing that will harm you or hurt you.
And what's the next place you put your hands when you're driving? Or on the steering wheel with your hands out?
If at all possible, turn your phone on.
And call someone and put it on speaker.
But whatever you're doing, I want you to say what you're doing before you do it.
You don't write any statements.
Well, you have to write a statement.
You don't have to write anything. You're a minor. I'm responsible for you. No one can tell you anything else.
If it tells you to be quiet, be quiet. Do everything that you can to get back to me. I see it weighing on you, and I don't want it to weigh on you.
I'm just worried about Donovan. I'm worried about him now.
Who are you guys talking about?
My nephew and her cousin.
I don't want him to be shot. I don't want him to go to jail.
You guys, if you could say anything to police, what would you say?
Learn about people, learn about their problems.
Take some diversity training. I mean, it should be like at this point, like a monthly requirement.
You know, there's really nothing at this point that they could do that would make me feel any safer with them without them just point blank, clearing them all out and starting all over from scratch.
So don't always assume that all of them are bad.
Mm-hmm. But all you see on the news and in newspapers, and it keeps happening. It's just in a different way. It's like how people are like, you should forgive so-and-so, but they keep doing it to me. I forgave them, but they keep doing it to me. It gets harder and harder to forgive them.
Wow.
I tear up almost every time that I watch that video. You have to watch it yourself. Listening to the podcast, you just get the audio and you miss just seeing the kids, right? And the tears and the little 8-year-old girl. I mean, my oldest daughter's 8, and she's in the video. She starts crying and goes on her dad's legs, goes on his lap, and I just think about how sensitive my 8-year-old is, and how, she doesn't have to fear her dad getting killed by police. And look, you can get fined whatever stat you want to get. I don't care. I really don't care, because what you just heard is so real for, again, trying not to just generalize, but the vast, vast majority of African Americans in this country. And it's a weight. This is the thing, too. It's a burden they have to carry every single day. Not just this one, not just about police, but there's so much they have to carry. Being a minority, it's like being in a world that's not theirs. And, it's so much more to get into than in just one episode. I don't have a great transition here, but I know I'm going kind of long, and I want to talk about the riots. We've talked a bit about police brutality, and just to kind of sum that up. I think why is Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd's cases becoming the cases of 2020? We've had other cases in the past, and I think these cases have built up upon each other to get to this point. But why does there seem to be more of a white reaction? For example, I saw Andy Stanley wrote, you should check out his Facebook post after Ahmaud Arbery's death. He's from Georgia. And they're both from Georgia, I should say. And it was the first time I've seen a white evangelical megachurch pastor really speak out against police brutality. I've seen them speak out. I've seen white evangelical megachurch pastors speak out before on some other justice issues, even though that's pretty rare. But police brutality is a really touchy subject in the white community. And if you speak out against it, I mean, no doubt, you're going to have people leave your church. You're going to have wealthy, people that make up your church and support your church. They're going to call you names. They're going to say you're replacing the gospel with politics, or you're preaching a social gospel. And so that, props to Andy Stanley for that. And Craig Groeschel is another one. He posted a video on Instagram. You can check that out after George Floyd's death. And I see that as the beginning of a shift and a change in the white evangelical church. And we'll see how much time we have to talk about that shift in the white evangelical church as a whole. But I think the reason Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd's deaths are capturing our attention the way they are is because they were so crystal clear. And again, they shouldn't have to be this crystal clear, right? There shouldn't have to be video, but this is the reason. I think because they're on video, and we've seen the videos before, and people, I think again, it's the accumulation effect. But you have just you watch those videos, and again, watch a sort of viewer discretion advised. I don't blame people at all, particularly people of color, that say, why do I want to watch that? Why would I want to watch someone just getting killed in cold blood? But if you watch them, there's nothing that could justify what just happened there. The guy's running away with no gun. He doesn't. There's no way these guys, the white guys' lives are threatened right now to just get gunned down like that. You just can't. You can't watch that and not have it affect you and just say. And here's the thing, back to the protests, those guys, the I think it was, I don't have the names in front of me, Carmichael, I think it was. He's a former sheriff or police officer. They weren't going to charge him. They weren't going to charge him. He's not even active duty. He's retired. He's just a dude in a pickup truck with a frickin' rifle. It's crazy. They weren't going to charge him until public got wind of it, and Black Lives Matter got wind of it, and people got wind of it, and the hashtag got wind of it. That's not an isolated incident. It's not a one-time thing. This is an injustice in the United States of America's legal system, in our country. And to see that, how can you as a Christian not speak out about it the way Andy Stanley did? And so I think because they're on video and George Floyd is on video and it's so crystal clear, You're killing someone. Dude, you have 4 police officers there. And you are killing this guy. He's telling you, you're killing me. The people talking to you are telling you, you're killing him. And I understand the PTSD of being a police officer. I don't understand what, I don't mean I've experienced it, but I'm saying I have empathy for you as a police officer, that your job is dangerous and your life is at stake. And enforcing in the inner city, it's not a walk in the park. I understand that, but you are killing somebody. You are not the judge and the jury and the executioner. There's a point as a human being where there's a line, and you can't cross that line. You can't kill somebody when you know you're killing them. You can't do that. And so here we are, and so we have these riots and we have these protests. And I've mentioned Michael Brown a couple times, and I mentioned I'd come back to it, and I may not have another spot to do it. I think with Michael Brown and Ferguson, it became a dividing case in the country because there was a hands up, don't shoot narrative. And I write about this a bit more in that blog article I recently wrote on Ahmaud Arbery. And I'm not God. I don't know what happened. I'm not going to say I know what happened. But what I know is there was an initial sort of witness account that Michael Brown had his hands up and was saying, don't shoot. It was kind of this innocent kid just walking down the street. And then they're in court, and you can find these. I linked to them. It was around 20 different eyewitness accounts they have, and they have them all written up. But the accounts are very conflicting, and many of the witnesses reported him charging the officer, and I think a couple had talked about him, reaching for the officer's firearm and things like that. And again, I wasn't there. I don't know what happened. I do think it's important to find out what happened and not jump to a conclusion about these things on the other side, I should say, of the political sort of polarization. But even in the case of Michael Brown, it allowed many people to then dismiss police brutality altogether, ignoring again the history of why that was such a powder keg case in Ferguson, Missouri. And if you read the history of it, you see a history of police brutality in Ferguson, Missouri. It wasn't a random, isolated thing that made the community explode and riot and those sorts of things there. And so I say that maybe in a way to try to, I don't want to say appease both sides of the fence, but to say we need objectivity in these things, and to say that just because you can find an exception to the rule and say, oh, it wasn't hands up, don't shoot, just like they said it was, that doesn't mean there's not police brutality, nor does it mean there wasn't police brutality in Ferguson, Missouri, or that there isn't, today. We want these convenient little ways, and you see it as soon as one of these sort of national hashtag cases happen, these other news outlets, I don't know what to call them. Maybe you can help me out with a word for it. But people start looking up every dirty detail about George Floyd's life or Ahmaud Arbery's life just so we can say, oh, he did deserve to die. Cool, yeah. Oh, yeah. He did deserve to get shot down in his neighborhood by these white guys in a pickup truck with some rifles. Yeah, because whatever. I don't remember what it was. He took a gun to school once or something. Like, oh, yeah, he deserves death. Cool. I'm good now. We can move on. No, there's no such thing as police brutality. You guys are all just kind of making that up. We're very, very broken. So it's really hard to see the police brutality, and it's worth protesting over, right? It is worth standing up and saying, this is wrong. Like, we can't just point at whatever it is. That's maybe an extreme example, but Nazi Germany, and say, oh, the Holocaust was wrong, or look back hundreds of years ago and say, oh, slavery was wrong. Come on. The culture we live in has injustices in it as well. And to look at these things and say, this is wrong. And I could go on, and I won't for sake of time, on scripture that commands us as followers of God, as God's people, to stand for justice, that God's heart is for justice, and to stand for the oppressed. This is not a social message. This is not a political message. I think it's certainly been hijacked by politics. This is a biblical message. This is a kingdom of God message. And that is the reason I'm so passionate about it. So it's very hard to see the police brutality. It's also very hard to see violent riots. It's very hard to see violent riots. If you want to know my take, I would say peaceful protests are great. I would participate in one. Violent riots where you're burning small businesses and you're burning police cars and you're spray painting property. It just breaks my heart. It breaks my heart to see it. And there's certainly black people who will say, look, these violent riots are needed to change things, to get attention. I don't know. I hope not. I hope that's not what's needed to change things and to get attention. There's many other black leaders who are saying they're lamenting the violence. You can see videos of black protesters at the protests going up to people that are trying to be violent and saying, stop. That's not what we're here for. Because what happens is everyone gets painted with a broad brush. And again, these people that don't want to believe that police brutality is a thing, they just say, ha, look at that. You're protesting the murder of George Floyd by murdering other people. You're protesting violence with violence, and then dismiss the whole thing. And that's what's so sad to me. That's what breaks my heart. And I'll be honest, it breaks my heart to see our president and his quick trigger to threaten with more force, and how he uses his Twitter account to do that. He threatens with force and with dogs and with violent weapons. It's just very anti-Jesus. Force, I'm going to combat force with more force. It's very anti-gospel. Our world is just really, really, really broken. And I was really encouraged. I saw a friend posted a link, and I reposted it, and I'll put it in the notes of this episode as well. But there was, at some cities that were having protest, police officers. Oh, it's powerful. I hope you read it. Police officers, they were kneeling. So kneeling is a reference to Colin Kaepernick, and kneeling is also a reference to the officer from Minneapolis that killed George Floyd. And kneeling, these officers are kneeling with protesters. And I cried reading that article too. And you see a police officer holding up a poster board with, you see a white police officer, and they're full gear, and they're holding up a poster board with a black protester. It says, "End police brutality" on it. I mean, that's the work of God. That's the grace of the gospel. That's the kingdom coming near. And when I see the SWAT team and the shielded helmets and the shields and the protesters, screaming in their face, and I see cars burning, and I see the president just igniting more anger with his anger. It's not of Jesus, and it just makes me so sad. And that so many Christians get caught up in that. And Jesus, he came to bring a new kingdom. He's not Republican. He's not Democrat. He wasn't Pharisee or Sadducee or Zealot or Essene. He wasn't pro-Caesar or anti-Caesar. He wasn't Roman. Greek, he came to bring a new kingdom. He just kind of said all that stuff. Don't do what the Gentiles do. That's not the way my kingdom works. Don't lord it over each other. He turned everything on its head. The king of the universe died on a cross. He washed feet. He said, turn the other cheek. This is what it means to follow Jesus. What's happened is we've plucked out a few verses from Paul, and they're good verses. They're the ones you all memorized, that I memorized growing up in Sunday school, about how you're saved by believing in Jesus. You know, well, John 3:16 is not from Paul, but Paul talking about it's not by works you're saved, but it's by grace, it's by faith. And if you call on the name of the Lord, you'll be saved. And those are true, and we're saved by Jesus' death on the cross and the empty tomb. But what we've done is we've hollowed Jesus out. We've removed his life. We've removed his teachings, his commands. We've removed what he said about the poor and the oppressed. We've removed God. We've removed the God of the Old Testament who hated injustice. There were two reasons the Israelites were exiled from the land: idolatry and injustice. And we've said, oh, come be a Christian, believe in Jesus, believe he died for your sins. You don't want to go to hell, do you? And we made the gospel all about you and you going to heaven and your personal salvation. And Jesus came to bring a kingdom, and the kingdom's meant to be here. He says it in the Lord's Prayer and over in the Gospels, especially in Matthew. He talks about the good news of the kingdom, the gospel of the kingdom. And in the Lord's Prayer in Matthew 6:10, he says, pray that God's kingdom would come here to this place, that God's will would be done here in this place. God's will and God's kingdom is that there would be no racism. God's will is that we would love one another. God's will is that we would not fight violence with violence, but we would fight violence with love. And fight wouldn't even be the right word at that point. Our world is really, really broken. Man, there's more I had in my notes that I want to get to, and this episode's getting super long. So there's some things I wanted to read to you from the book Divided by Faith. It's just the book that changed my life. I encourage you to read it. Divided by Faith by Michael Emerson and Christian Smith. It's a bit more of how did we get here? Let me just read you some notes from the book. So chapter 1 of the book talks about how segregation began and how that has never been addressed fully to this day, how segregation began. But it helps us understand the playing field we have of unequal segregation. That's a key phrase, unequal segregation, which results in unequal employment, unequal education, unequal opportunity. It also helps us to understand the inequality in religion, which helped intensify the divide between the races. Okay, next. White evangelicals didn't talk about racial divide because it could take the focus away or hindered their call to evangelism. So let that sink in for a second. White evangelicals, they're talking about through history. This is a sociological book. They give you a historical overview, and then they do a contemporary overview by interviewing white evangelicals. And one of the main points they bring out from our history is that white evangelicals traditionally did not talk about the racial divide because it would take away from evangelism. So I want to evangelize sort of white people. I want them to know Jesus so they don't go to hell. But if I invite them to my church and they hear me talking about racism, but they're racist, right? Because they're white. Then they're not going to want to know about Jesus. They're gonna leave. And so that is the reason historically, and Divided by Faith goes through it. Well, there's multiple reasons, but that's one of the main ones. Divided by Faith goes through it sort of era by era throughout our country's history. That's always been the thread. And that's the same today, why many, many white evangelical churches will not talk about race issues, and it's just starting to change, just the beginning, and hopefully it continues, because we're going to talk about evangelism, and again, some would say that's a political issue or whatever, but if I were to talk about racism and inequality, then people are going to leave my church. Okay, so we'll just leave it at that. We'll leave it at that. People are going to leave my church, and again, I want them I want to evangelize them. And so how could that happen? You can't evangelize a racist white person if you talk about racism. Again, then the problem is you end up with whole bunches of people that have converted to Christianity, and again, it's that hollowed out version of it. It's I believe in Jesus, but yeah, and that's another, I don't know, that's another topic of what about all of his teachings? All right. So this is coming from page 42 in the book, because I'm just going to read this one straight from the book. It talks about how the ghetto was formed. This was one of the most, I think, helpful, transformative pieces of the book for me. Well, one of the many. How did we get here? When I grew up in Troy, Ohio, suburb of Dayton, Ohio, almost all white people, I never thought twice about it. It wasn't until I lived in Lansing, living in the inner city, and I'm around black people, and then doing the inner city park ministry and around black poor people, and going, whoa, this poor neighborhood is filled with black people. And the suburbs, where it's like nice to live, they're filled with white people. How did that happen? Every city in the United States is that way. You could look at a stark divide. There's been studies about, Beverly Hills and how close it is to Watts and Compton, and you look at the schools and the statistics and race. It's like all white people almost in Beverly Hills, and almost all black people or people of color in Watts and Compton. How did that happen? But it's not just there. It's in every single, it's like big and small metropolitan area in the United States. Black people live in the inner city where it's run down and dangerous and poor, and then white people live in the suburbs where it's not run down and where the houses are bigger and better and nicer and it's, safer and all these sorts of things. How did that happen? Let's think about it. Be careful how you answer too, if you haven't been exposed to these things. So this is in the Renewed Concern section, 1917 to 1950. Several events centering around World War I changed this being the population demographic. In 1870, over 90% of African Americans lived in the South, and over 80% lived in the rural South. So 1870, almost all black people lived in the South. Very few lived in the North. By 1910, this had changed little. Northern industries needed workers, but immigrants from other lands filled these needs. With the coming of World War I, however, immigration slowed while the demand for labor increased. In a monumental change for African Americans and for American race relations, blacks began leaving the rural South in large numbers for northern and southern cities. And for the first time, white Northerners, including evangelicals, began encountering African Americans in large numbers. They did not react well. Okay, so it was the coming of World War I. That was domino number one. Immigration slowed down because of the coming of World War I. That was domino number two. And with the coming of World War I, the demand for labor increased. So at this time in our nation's history, the lower paying labor jobs, industrial jobs, were filled by immigrant workers in the early 1900s. Those workers weren't there anymore, but jobs needed to be filled. So you have this mass migration of black people that were living in the rural South, now moving into northern and southern cities to fill, for the first time ever, to fill these industrial jobs. And it says that the white people there did not react well. Through practices such as racial steering as well as violence, northern whites during this period birthed the black urban ghetto, a quintessential urban feature of contemporary American society as the solution to the rise in the urban black population. Racial violence increased in urban areas as whites fought to protect their jobs and neighborhoods. Between 1917 and 1921, one black home in Chicago was bombed, on average, every 20 days. African Americans, often used as strike breakers by northern industrialists, were viewed with contempt not only for their color, but also the economic threat they represented. Urban riots at the time, whites attacking blacks, became a northern problem. Yes. It's funny to think, not funny, it's sad to think about. We think about rioting, a bunch of white people rioting together to attack blacks. Violence, sorry, it's hard to read this. Violence heightened in the South as well. The Ku Klux Klan resurged, and black servicemen returning from World War I were even lynched while still in uniform. Suddenly, the racial issue became once again, in the eye of whites, a problem. And so the book will go on and talk about redlining, which was legal up until 1970, where once black people were in these urban cores of the city, the white people all moved out. They moved out to the suburbs. And I have a blog article written several years ago on how the white suburbs were made. So you can check that out. I'll leave a link to that. And it talks about redlining and basically how there was not a way for a black person to even buy a house out in the suburbs. And the suburbs were built, some suburbs were built using GI Bill money after World War II. So white people were just given a low mortgage rate and given money to buy a house in the suburbs in neighborhoods that were built just for them. And this is post-World War II. This is in the 50s and 60s. And black people couldn't go into those neighborhoods. There was not a legal way for them to go into those neighborhoods. So it wasn't by accident that we got to where we are today in the way neighborhoods are set up and in where resources are within these neighborhoods. You can see the groundwork for that in the section that I just read. A little bit more from Divided by Faith. White evangelicals focus more on the individual level components, leaving the larger racialized social structures intact. This is the difference between setting one slave free versus ending slavery. Another note, race is not a focal point of the day-to-day events of a white person. It's hard for a white person to understand the true race problem, as they don't have to live with the everyday effects like a black person. Conversely, blacks describe this problem like it's breathing air. White evangelicals believe that social injustices are caused by individual choices. So you're poor because you're making bad choices. And we've all heard that. I've heard that. Why are people poor? Because they made bad choices. Versus the idea that you made bad choices because you are poor. So that being poor actually leads you to make bad choices. And we could talk about that. It makes total sense. Most kids that have food and opportunity, their parents are able to buy them some toys or, things that they want, they don't go out and steal. The kids that don't have food, don't have some toys or the things they want, they're going to be more likely to go out and steal, right? It makes It makes sense. And I don't mean for that to be an oversimplification as well. It's just to get you, it's to get a new paradigm thinking about crime even in some of these things. And again, that's a whole another subject that don't have time to get into right now. So last quote, last thing from Divided by Faith. 2 baseball teams are playing. One is up by 20 in the 7th inning, and it's discovered they have been cheating. They apologize, but the score is still 20-0. They continue playing, and the other team is simply asked to catch up. I wanted to end by talking about what's missing in the white church. If you're still hanging in there in this long episode, thank you. This is normal for I've been easy on you in recent episodes. I was going close to 2 hours for a lot of these flip sides up until recently. They've shortened a little bit, so you're getting a bonus episode today. See, it's been so long that I've been with you, that I've missed you, that I'm giving you double the content today. So that way you don't, get too upset and want your money back for being a subscriber to the flip side. So let me just end with this. I'll try to keep it relatively short, but we need to talk about what does it look like going forward? What needs to happen going forward? Again, it's good to post these things on social media to show your white friends that, hey, I'm not cool with this, and to show your friends of color that, hey, I'm beginning to understand, and I'm with you, particularly in a Christian context, because what black people are used to is white churches never talking about this, and what that means is white churches are denying that this exists, even they're doing it indirectly, and so why would a black person want to go to a white church when their experience is not validated there? How can you be in community if, let's say, a small group is supposed to be a place where you can share prayer requests and support one another, and you say, I am really burdened this week by the fear of police officers intimidating me. I was pulled over, and this officer just really intimidated me. He had his hand on his gun when he came up to my car. And it really just freaked me out, and I'm really struggling with really just living in America. Like it's just really heavy for me and my kids, and they share that in your group, and half the group says, like, whether they would say it or not, that's not real. That's in your head. That didn't happen. Like that's not a thing. That creates such an unsafe place, let alone if they never hear it from the pulpit. And we're opening the Bible week after week after week saying, this is from God, this is from God, this is from God. And they're saying, so God obviously doesn't care that I live in a place of unequal opportunity, and I live in a place where I have microaggressions against me every day because of my skin color. I guess God doesn't care about that. Okay. Like, all right. And so these are the things that happen. And so I want to talk about what's missing and what needs to happen going forward, at least to get the ball rolling and to get you thinking. I've hit on some of it already, even I think in what I just said, but ultimately it comes down to, this is on an individual level, church level, political level. There needs to be less distance, less segregation, more proximity. Divided by Faith, it chronicles how we got to be so racialized, so separated. And as long as we stay separated, this will never change. This will never change as long as we stay separated, because there's only an understanding when we come together. And it's very, very broken. It's not that easy. Right? It's not easy. Oh, it's not easy. White people are broken. Black people are broken. Everybody in between's broken. Look, and certainly I don't mean to not talk about Asians and Native Americans and Latinos and everyone who makes up, speaking specifically of the United States racism. There's racism in other countries, but this is our deepest divide. And when these protests are coming about George Floyd's death and Ahmaud Arbery's death that we've seen on video, it's from this deep divide that started with chattel slavery, and it is a legacy that we are still dealing with to this day. So the second piece, beyond less distance, less segregation, more proximity, is urban development. Is how do we reverse what we did in the early 1900s and pre-World War I, and then everything that came after that, where we and if you watch another, there's a, you won't be able to find it. Sorry. I was going to talk, I was thinking of the documentary 13th, which is very good, and I recommend it. There's another documentary it's just called Race, and it was done by PBS, and I own it on DVD. Oh, it's so good. I'll put a link as well to that. But they do a really good job in talking about redlining and talking about how once all these black people moved into the city, that the local governments just sucked all the resources out of those areas as far as what tax revenue would cover, and schools and roads and jobs and all these sorts of things. It's really, really a mess. So going forward, I think, and you don't hear this a lot, but I think the macro level solution is part of it. A part of that solution is urban development and jobs and opportunity in the inner city. And that is a lot easier said than done. And I won't get into all of it right now, but that is a huge, huge component. And I say that from experience. I say that from living in the inner city and from doing inner city ministry for a very, very long time. I think in conclusion, I just want to ask for your grace towards me from this podcast episode. One of the things I love about doing a podcast is it's a conversation. You can talk. It's more real time. But obviously some of the downside of that, especially when doing a sensitive topic such as this, is you don't get to have the precision that you would have in a blog post or in a book, where you can really edit your stuff and no, I don't want to say it that way. Oh, that could be misunderstood, or that could be misconstrued. And I realize you could quote something that I said in this podcast and maybe even take it out of context. And so I'd ask that you don't do that. I would just ask for your grace to know the heart behind this. I hope you can hear my heart behind this episode, and it is that this has to be a part of our discipleship. This has to be a part of what it means to follow Jesus. This has to be a part of the church. And I want this podcast to be a place, and I want my life to be a place as a pastor where we continue to push that ball forward. And so I would ask you to continue doing the same thing as well, and to do it with respect and with understanding and with love. And I hope that you felt that from me. And if you disagree with me and you have, know that that's okay, that I love you, that we can talk about these things as brothers and sisters in Christ, and, we can learn from each other. And so hopefully this was a place for you to learn. Sad as it is, there will be no Noah's rant today. I wasn't going to do one anyway, but I didn't want to tell you that at the beginning and douse your hopes. I just knew this was going to be a pretty heavy subject, and Noah's rant is not heavy at all, right? It's meant to be fun, and it actually is a fun way to end the podcast. I don't like ending on sort of a more solemn note. And so, if you need some Noah's rant, go back to the email from Aaron about the Doritos. I think that was like a mini rant. We could count that as a mini rant on Dorito flavors. But yeah, I could rant on Doritos all day long, baby. So, but yeah, thank you for listening. I really love doing the podcast. I missed it while I was doing my intensive. I'm still doing my intensive. What am I talking about? I got up at 6 a.m., baby, just for you guys. Just for you. I really do love this. I hope it's fruitful. I do love hearing from you. I mean, in a way, I want to say, I'm just a human like you. I love encouragement. If the podcast is encouraging to you, let me know. I would love for you to share it on social media and tag me in that share. iTunes does not make it easy to go through and leave a review, but if you could leave a review, that means a lot as well. So I really do appreciate you listening. We'll have some good interviews coming up. Eventually we'll have some swag for you for Patreon supporters. I am hiring. If you want to be my Patreon swag store creator, let me know, and I'll hook you up with some free swag. Until next time, I'll see you on the flip side.
The Flip Side with Noah Filipiak is a South Francis Press production. Copyright Noah Filipiak, www.noahfilipiak.com. Theme music by Kyle Lake at K-Lake Music, used with permission. Please subscribe and leave a review on iTunes or wherever podcasts are found.
Souls needing revivals, what do I do? Influence like the cup full of that Bombay. Kelly's to them Tom Hanks, Lexus to them Andres. Hoping they check it, my inner reverence, stressing for leverage. That they see the king's tracks on the pavement leading to heaven. Yow, dripping in that gold that don't perish. People selling fake, see the green around their belly. Taking refuge in his hands, see his palms, my living quarters. Close them when I'm finished, then it's time to bring me closer. There's no purgatory, cause you're in or you're out. When you see him in the clouds, then you know it's going down. Raise them. They've been sleeping for some ages. Now all God's babies so confused by this hatred. Pulpit preachers shouldn't aim to be A-list. Money probably long, but short is with your days. Have you ever heard the sound of freedom? Have you ever heard the sound of freedom? Have you ever heard the sound of freedom? Tripping upon the premise, see lyrics painting the image, pointing to redemption to the one who got them splinters. Cause that cross is nothing pretty. So why the beauty pageants and caught up in emotions and following your passions? Talking that freedom, our people need them more than that Easter or coffee shop discussions, debating over baristas. Please, sir, this is why we inked up. Even when they do the autopsy, they still see him. Freedom coming quickly. Bars from the spirit. Put it through the preamp and mix it like a chemist. Put it in the airwaves and hoping that they hear it. If there's some confusion, then I hope you see him clearly. Raise them. They've been sleeping for some ages. Now all God's babies so confused by this hatred. Pulpit preachers shouldn't aim to be A-list. Money probably long, but short is with your dad.